Hello and welcome to South2North, coming to you from Johannesburg. As the Tokyo International Conference on African Development kicks off in Yokohama in Japan, we look at how Africa can best benefit from its current economic boom. In just 10 years, Africa has become one of the most dynamic regions in the world. A combination of natural and human resources has fueled huge investments from both traditional and emerging powers. But can we turn this current boom into a repeat of Asia's economic miracle? Shortly, I will be talking to Japan's ambassador to South Africa, Yutaka Yoshizawa. But before that, a few days ago in Cape Town, South Africa, I was able to talk to Dr Ibrahim Mayaki, former Prime Minister of Niger and current head of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, also known as NEPAD. I asked him how successful his organization has been in driving Africa's renewal.
When NEPAD was created in 2001, Africa was looking like Greece today, which means that the quality of our public management systems was low. Our capacity to think strategically was low. And the inclusivity of our public policy design and implementation processes was low. In 12 years now, these things have been transformed. Today, as Christine Lagarde of the IMF is saying, Africa's public finances are better managed than Europe's public finances. Our domestic resources have been multiplied by 5 between 2000 and 2012. And governance-wise, the rate of democratic intensity has been really accelerated. So what did NEPAD play as a role? NEPAD played the role of a catalytic agent in promoting strategic continental frameworks in agriculture, infrastructure, health, and education. And our main objective is to boost the regional integration agenda through very concrete projects. It can be the Brazzaville-Kinshasa bridge. It can be the Trans-Saharan highway from Algiers to Lagos, which is almost finalized. So these are the things we do, very concrete things on the ground. Are we doing
those things already, or are we still at the policy formation level? In other words, have we reached the phase now, 12 years since the launch of NEPAD, have we reached the phase of implementation?
We are not at the policy level. We are at the implementation level. So when I'm talking about the Brazzaville-Kinshasa bridge, the feasibility studies have been done, and it is on the step of being a bankable project. When I'm talking about agriculture, we have a framework, which is CADEP, the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program. That framework targets two main objectives. 10% of public resources allocated to agriculture, and 6% agricultural productivity rate per year. Mm-hmm. Now, on the 54 African countries, we have 35 compacts, national plans of agriculture, that have been supported by NEPAD concretely on the ground.
Let's talk a little bit about the agriculture plan. The commitment was that 10% is the target. And I know that countries like Senegal and Malawi and Niger are leading in that particular regard. What of the rest of the African countries?
We could do much better, because up to now we have around 14 countries which have reached that target. But we should be really at around 30 to 35 countries. So we have a lot of homework to do. So we're lagging behind. We are lagging behind in what relates to that objective. And one of our main preoccupations today is to boost that sense of prioritizing agriculture in the national development plans. And this is what we are trying to do by framing national investment plans in agriculture.
I know that NEPAD has a program for infrastructure development in Africa. I don't understand how this was only launched in January 2012, when it was very clear from earlier on that our economies will not grow without the right infrastructure. Regional development will not be achieved without infrastructure development. Why did we leave it till so late?
You are absolutely right. The picture was scattered projects all over without sound prioritization, a very weak coordination between countries, and a very weak capacity to formulate projects. That was the picture. So what we decided to do, through an intensive consultation of regional economic communities that have master plans in infrastructure, try to pick out of these master plans key priority projects on which the countries within the regional economic community had agreed upon, and then put these priorities together in a long-term perspective, 30-year perspective. And out of these 51 projects, we have around 10 projects which are immediately bankable. Mm-hmm. In order to fund them, the mechanism that we use is public-private partnerships. And this is why the quality of our regulatory frameworks and the global enabling conditions is absolutely essential. But Africa has made a lot of progresses in framing sound and adapted, effective, coherent regulatory frameworks.
What about FDI? Have we capitalized on the fact that economies elsewhere are slowing down? You mentioned Greece earlier, that Africa was exactly like Greece a couple of years ago. But have we taken advantage then of the hardships, I suppose, that Europe and the US, for example, have faced in attracting FDI?
This is a very good question, because if you look at the African infrastructure funds, they have grown 5 times in the last 6 years. If you look at the sovereign wealth funds, they are being more and more attracted by Africa. Why? Because the returns are better than in other regions of the world. So they are becoming natural partners of Africa in investing in infrastructure. We just have to be sufficiently intelligent in managing the risks. And one of the main risks, beyond the issues of enabling conditions and regulatory frameworks, is the political risk. Mm-hmm. And that political risk, we do explain the fact that we are the only continent in the world which has an early warning system in terms of conflictual issues. We are the only continent in the world which immediately replies to any type of coup, and there are not many. And we are the only continent in the world where you have an immediate response from the African Union.
Should we be even having coups at this point in our development? Surely then that is a major, major obstacle. To have the warning signs is positive, mm-hmm. but the fact that the climate in some African countries is still ripe for coups is disturbing.
Africa is composed of 54 countries. The process of nation-state building has been an arduous process. Many of these countries have what we could call artificial boundaries. And the political leadership within these artificial boundaries has had an extreme obligation to really create the basis of national coherence. If you have a conflict in Slovenia, investors will not ask, what about myself investing in Spain? And Europe is much smaller than Africa. So Africa has still that image, which is changing a lot, because we communicate on the dynamics which are taking place. And these dynamics are extremely important today.
In fact, I wanted to talk to you about the change then in perceptions about our continent. You mentioned Christine Lagarde, head of the IMF, saying that we have better financial control. You've said in a previous interview that Africans themselves merely repeat the negative stories of the West, of Africa as a failed continent with weak financial controls, weak democratic systems. What will it take to change that, so that we are seen as equal partners and so that we attract the investments that we need for the growth of our continent?
I think we should do 3 things. The first one is communicate more on the success stories. 2/3 of Africans are under 25. This is a vibrant continent. The class of entrepreneurs that we have today is extremely competitive, well-trained, and with high ambitions. The good news is coming from that silent revolution of an entrepreneurship that has the skills to move Africa forwards. It's not coming from the governments. What we are asking from the governments is to make sure that the enabling conditions exist, that security does exist, that property rights are respected, and that they fit into the regional integration agenda by supporting the regional programs and projects designed by the African Union. So the second thing that we should do is give more voice to the youth. Such a young continent cannot be governed as an old continent. 2/3 of Africans are under 25. 2/3 of Europeans are over 45. You cannot govern Africa as you would govern Europe because the dynamics are not the same and the pressure is extremely high. Thirdly, women. Africa will trigger its development when women are empowered because they are the majority of that youth. They are the ones who feed the continent because small-scale farmers are producing 80% of the food of this continent, and most of the small-scale farmers who produce that food are women.
You were Prime Minister of Niger from 1997 to 2000. Was it a particularly difficult period at that time to be a Prime Minister?
That period was a period of very hard choices because you needed to make choices that had an impact on social policies, and it's always very hard to touch social policies. But we have come out of that with a strengthened governance system, with a strengthened quality of a management of our public finances. So somehow that generation had to sacrifice itself very humbly in order to put Africa on the good rails. One good news is that the enhancement of the quality of our public policies and their implementation has allowed a better comprehension of the regional integration agenda. We are much more open to regional integration processes today than 10 years ago.
Dr. Mayaki, we're not the only continent that's been poised for this growth. Asia is there and has been there before us. What can Africa learn from Asia's economic boom?
Africa can learn three things. First of all, internal national partnerships are essential. The big conglomerates in Korea were stimulated by the Korean government. Japan was reconstructed after the Second World War through MITI, the Ministry of Industry and Trade. And the leaders of MITI were private sector operators, public sector officials. So national partnerships are extremely important. National cohesion, national social cohesion. Secondly, development finance. We neglected during many years development finance for example, the agricultural sector. And there has not been any agricultural development or revolution in the history of economics without subsidies. Thirdly, ownership. When Malaysia was ordered by the World Bank to follow a specific strategy, they didn't apply the instruction, and they owned their own strategy based on their own realities, and that was what allowed them really to become an emerging continent. So at the end of the day, it's a question of ownership and strategy. We are going to Japan for the TICAD conference in June. 10 years ago, African countries would have gone to beg aid. Today, and next June, what we are going to do is link with the Japanese private sector in order to attract them on our projects, on our programs. The era of aid is dead.
Ambassador Yoshizawa, welcome then to South2North. He says the era of aid is dead. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, in fact, in the last 5 years, Japan's aid to Africa has been doubled from $1.7 billion to more than $3.4 billion. But having said that, it is true that there has been a number of Japanese investments in the Africa region. More than 60% of that investments are directed towards the South Africa, and they are very active in many areas, such as the mining beneficiation, manufacturing, and infrastructure building. And I hope that TICAD 5 will be a very important moment for many Japanese companies to be aware of the more opportunities in Africa.
You mentioned the International Conference on African Development. Tell us about it. What is its significance?
TICAD process, TICAD is a Tokyo International Conference on African Development, has started 20 years ago in 1993. And since then, Japan has been hosting a TICAD leaders meeting every 5 years. And in TICAD 4, back in 2008, 41 heads of state and governments of the African countries participated.
Are positive partnerships coming out of that so that Africa is seen as a place to do business? You talked about how Japan has doubled its aid to Africa. Perhaps that's a positive thing, but on the other hand, does it prove that Africa perhaps is not taking advantage of its potential?
Of course, Africa is far away from Japan, and traditionally the aid is more center of the relationship between Africa and Japan. But increasingly, Japanese companies are coming to Africa for trade, investments, and I'm sure that as Africa is rapidly growing, there will be more Japanese companies coming.
Who stands to benefit from that Japanese presence, or any Asian country for that matter?
Well, I suppose that already Japanese activities in the Africa region are contributing to African countries a great deal through job creation, skill transfer, and human resources development. And of course, the Japanese companies will come because that will benefit them as well. But also African countries will be benefited from such investments.
We have a situation in South Africa, and I imagine many other African countries, where China's presence is growing, but also seen as threatening, especially amongst local businesses and the workers who are arguing that Africa is being recolonized by China. Is Japan as concerned about China's dominance and China flooding all markets with its products?
I think it is only natural for the many Chinese companies increase their activities in African countries, given the rapidly growing economy of China. But we believe that Japan or Japanese companies have an important role to play in the Africa region, particularly in the area of job creation, skill transfer, and human resources development.
Let's go back to the East Asia miracle. It was a miracle until the 1990s, when Thailand devalued its currencies and things went downhill after that. In hindsight, should we still be describing it as a miracle? And do such economic miracles come at great cost later on in the future?
Of course, at times that in the process of economic developments, there are at times ups and downs. But if you look back what happened in Asia, I think in many countries of Asia have achieved a great economic growth. And I think that will be happening in Africa, and through adequate education or the skill transfer, human resources development. I'm sure that the days will come that many African countries will also see such miracle, if you like.
Can you elaborate more on the pillars of the East Asian miracle? I mean, what were the building blocks of it? We are living in a continent where we have problems with infrastructure. There's a skills shortage. Our education system leaves much to be desired. Can you achieve an economic miracle without those pillars? And how did Japan prepare itself?
Well, I suppose that most important ingredient, if you like, for the Africa growth is the young population. And that is a great asset for African countries. But of course, that should be supported by adequate education, training, and also, as you said, the infrastructure. And well, I suppose that Japan had played a very important role in the economic growth of Asian countries through infrastructure building, skill transfer, and we want to do the same in African countries.
Mm-hmm. And what else can Africa learn from Asia, especially when it comes to the area of diversifying our economies? We've got the raw material, but we don't have industries, we don't have the capacity to manufacture. Our raw materials leave our shores and come back as finished and more expensive products. What can we learn from countries such as Japan?
Well, of course, some of the Asian countries are also the very important exporters of raw materials, such as Indonesia and so on. And I think that it is true that the raw materials is a great asset for Africa to earn the foreign currency. And hopefully that through the sales of these natural resources, they will be able to use that money to do things for the economic growth, such as the infrastructure building or the human resources development.
All right, so we've spoken about infrastructure, we've spoken about human resources. What about political stability? A lot of Africa is democratized over the years, but how concerned are Asian investors about governments here in Africa, concerns for human rights? What is the conversation?
I think compared to the decades ago, many African countries have become politically stable. On the other hand, it is true that there are some political instability in some of the African countries. And Japan has been doing, for its part, its contribution to address the peace and stability in the Africa region. For instance, back in March of this year, Japanese Foreign Minister Mr. Kishida announced the initiative to contribute, for instance, 550 million US dollars for the peace and stability in the Africa region. And of course, the political stability is very important in inviting the foreign investments. But I think all in all, Africa is going towards the right direction.
What about cultural exchange? Because that's perhaps one area that we ignore in our drive to maximize economic growth. But there's a lot that can be exchanged between different regions in terms of culture and education as well.
But of course, we want to see more cultural exchange, more educational exchange between South Africa and Japan, or Africa and Japan. Of course, Africa is still far away from Japan. Not many Japanese people know about Africa. Among some Japanese people, for instance, African culture is very much appreciated, this traditional culture, or the African music, African art. So I hope that we will be able to increase the Japanese people who understand Africa properly.
I suppose then, Ambassador, with you then attending the conference that gets underway in Japan, Tokyo International Conference on Africa Development, we in Africa want to hear a message that Africa is ready for business. Is that the message you will be taking, and what else about this part of the world?
We want to let African countries understand that the Africa matters to Japan, and we are aware that Africa is rapidly growing, and we want to be part of it. This conference will be a good opportunity for the Japanese companies to understand more.
Well, Ambassador Yoshizawa, we hope that will happen, and we wish you success in your deliberations. Thank you very much for talking to us today. Thanks for joining me on South to North. Remember, you can tweet your questions, comments, and opinions to @AJ South to North, or find us on Facebook. Thank you for watching. See you next week. Bye-bye.